Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Nicole Ardoin, the Faculty Director of the EMIT Interdisciplinary Program in Environment and Resources, or E-IPER, and also a faculty member in the Graduate School of Education and a senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment. And I am so honored and delighted to be one of Kika's lead advisors. Thank you so much for joining us today in E-IPER's dissertation defense, where we have the pleasure of hosting Kika Santana's dissertation defense presentation together today. Her title for her dissertation defense is Together in Changing Places, the Role of Social and Affective Dimensions in Conservation and Adaptation Behavior. After the successful completion of the university oral examination, today we hope to formally award Kika a doctoral degree in Environment and Resources. As part of Kika's examination committee, we are joined today by her lead advisors. I am one of the two co-lead advisors. I am joined also by Gabrielle Wong-Parodi, who is an assistant professor in Earth System Science and a center fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. The other members of Kika's dissertation reading committee are here as well. We have Larry Crowder, the Edward Ricketts Provostial Professor of Marine Ecology and Conservation, senior fellow in the Woods Institute for the Environment, and William Durham, the Bing Professor in Human Biology in the Department of Anthropology Emeritus. After Kika has finished her presentation today, members of the audience will have the opportunity to ask questions. I will moderate this process and repeat it again later, but as a heads up, members of the audience attending virtually may also, well, which is actually everybody today, may ask their questions by typing them into the Q&A box, and I am happy to read your questions out to Kika. And you also have the opportunity, I believe, to read them aloud if you would like. And so we are able to unmute you if you'd like to do that. So please let us know. I am now going to give a more formal introduction. And actually, I'm sorry, I'm actually pinch hitting today for Michelle Anderson, who is our dissertation defense chair today. And we're delighted to have Michelle with us as well. Her bandwidth is not permitting her to do this role, but we're so grateful to Michelle for chairing today as well. So thank you so much, Michelle. So it is now my honor and pleasure to formally introduce Francisca Kika Santana to all of you for her dissertation defense. Kika's curiosity about people and places is absolutely infectious. She is deeply dedicated to understanding how and why people care about their places and take action to become engaged in them. From Hawaii to California to coastal Louisiana and beyond, Kika's ability to connect with people, understand their situations and concerns, and ask questions that are both theoretically grounded and with practical implications is truly impressive. Kika came to Stanford with a background working in nonprofits and government agencies, and with an undergraduate degree in history and a master's in coastal marine science and management from UC Santa Barbara. She's used those skills masterfully and brought these interdisciplinary perspectives to the work that you'll see presented here today. In addition to being a careful and thoughtful scholar, Kika is an excellent educator. Along with her colleagues, Kika has developed and taught many courses, including those in social oceans and environmental justice. And fortunately for me, Kika worked as a TA in one of my earliest versions of a course in qualitative interviewing. She was such a valuable thought partner, thanks to her deep experience in community engaged work with interviewing. In addition to teaching, Kika has been a mentor across and beyond campus. For example, she has been a STEM Fellows mentor, a Women in Science mentor, and much more. For that teaching and excellent mentoring, Kika has been honored with the very prestigious Lieberman Award. And in addition to all of this, Kika has been a tremendous member of the Stanford community in E-IPER and beyond. She served, for example, as the student rep on the E-IPER Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and our executive committee. She has also been a key member of the various lab groups of which she is a part. She's played important roles in our social ecology lab, organizing and participating in events, welcoming new members, attending and planning writing sessions, and much more. And I know that she's done the same in Larry Crowder's lab, that of Gabrielle Wong-Parodi's group, and that of Bill Durham as well. I have always been so inspired by Kika's interest in her work, and I am certain that you will be as well. I am thrilled that we'll be hearing about her dissertation research today. And so now I will turn it over to you, Kika. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Nicole, for that really generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. I am really pleased to be with you all today, albeit virtually, to share my dissertation research entitled Together in Changing Places, the Role of Social and Affective Dimensions in Conservation and Adaptation Behavior. So many of you know that this past year I've been living in Paris with my partner Casey. And today of all days, we are in the middle of a truly brutal heat wave that may set new record temperatures for most of Europe and has set off wildfires across the continent. Right now it's currently 102 degrees Fahrenheit outside and it's about 6 p.m. here. And this is in a city where very few people have air conditioning in their homes, including us. And since the heat wave started last week, I've actually been thinking how easily my cat, Marty, seems to adapt to these hot temperatures. Cats in general seem to know exactly what to do when it's hot. They kind of get lazy, stretch out, and sleep. But obviously for humans, it's not quite as simple. We still have to get up, go to work, take care of our families, and sometimes the most appropriate actions to adapt are not quite as obvious to us. So admittedly, it can sometimes be overwhelming to think about the many climate and environmental threats that we now face as a society. It's just this past year's weather events have shown anthropogenic environmental change poses great risks to human health and well-being. From extreme wildfire events in the American West, spurring mass evacuations and power shutoffs, to the ongoing loss of marine biodiversity affecting the lives and livelihoods of people in coastal communities, to finally more intense and frequent storms and flooding that threaten homes in both urban and rural areas. So it's clear that we, the collective we of humanity, must do more to respond to and adapt to the already occurring and increasing climate impacts and environmental changes. And to successfully do so, action must be taken at multiple scales, from international governance efforts, such as the COP26 meeting in Glasgow last year, all the way down to individual and personal actions, like buying an air filter for one's home. And the work I will share with you today focuses on that individual scale of behavior. Although it's only one piece of the puzzle, individual behavior is important because it can mitigate harms and reduce threats to personal health and well-being, contribute to the resilience of ecosystems to climate change, and in the aggregate, advance system-level transformation. And in addition, I want to note that vulnerability to climate impacts and environmental change also occurs at many scales. Individuals, communities, and regions are differentially at risk from the effects of environmental change. Some communities do not have access to institutional power or have been historically excluded from setting conservation priorities. So throughout my work, I seek to advance more just adaptation and conservation outcomes by learning more about the experiences of vulnerable individuals and working with communities through research partnerships. And the overall goal of my dissertation work is to advance our understanding of how social and affective dimensions relate to individual conservation and adaptation behavior. And here when I say affective, I am referring to an emotional involvement with nature. And I aim to do this by using multiple methods, primarily surveys and interviews, and when possible through community engaged and participatory research. I draw from approaches across several fields and disciplines, including social and conservation psychology, environmental sociology, and natural hazards. And I hope to contribute to the development of theory as well as the production of actionable knowledge. My dissertation has 3 chapters. The first is focused on understanding the factors that may motivate coral reef conservation behavior on Maui, Hawaii. The second is a case study in Northern California, exploring how individuals make decisions to protect their health from wildfire smoke. And the third examines adaptation to co-occurring climate-related health hazards in the US, specifically wildfire smoke and COVID-19. My first chapter is entitled Malama Ike Kai, which translates to Care for the Ocean in Hawaii, exploring psychosocial factors associated with personal and community coral reef conservation behavior on Maui, Hawaii. Coral reefs, sometimes called the rainforests of the sea, are among the most biologically rich and productive ecosystems on Earth. They provide valuable benefits to millions of people who rely on coastal resources for their livelihoods. And in Hawaii, reefs are of particular importance due to their significance to Indigenous Hawaiian culture, as well as the tourism economy. However, coral reef ecosystems are in decline due to human activity, from ocean warming, which leads to coral stress and bleaching, overharvesting and overfishing, pollution and sedimentation from coastal development, and importantly, coastal tourism and ocean-based recreation. And although climate change is the main driver of coral reef decline, evidence suggests that local conservation efforts can improve the capacity of reefs to survive future climate threats. And on Maui, in the face of increasing tourism and coastal recreation, two organizations, Polonui Hiu, a grassroots Hawaiian community group, and the Nature Conservancy, a global conservation NGO, are working to promote natural resource management and sustainable human reef interactions. And in 2017, in response to the community discovering that their reefs were being actively damaged by recreational activity, they created an ocean-friendly guide for Maui visitors, as well as a pledge, the Pono or Righteousness Pledge. And it's with this context in mind that I began working with these two groups in 2019, and we began thinking about what motivates coral reef conservation behavior among coastal users. And from the start, our goal was to consider how culturally relevant Hawaiian values may inform the answer to this question. And in this project, we followed the key principles of community-engaged participatory research, which centers the contributions made by the Hawaiian community partners by collaborating at all stages of the research process, from research design to dissemination of findings, by validating multiple sources of knowledge and ways of knowing, by centering reciprocity through between researchers and community partners, and by promoting social justice through action and applications of the research. So a large body of literature suggests that there are a number of psychosocial factors that may be precursors to conservation action. For example, studies have shown that subjective social norms and perceptions of efficacy can influence pro-environmental or conservation behavior. Social norms, which I will discuss more in chapter 2 and 3, are the informal standards of behavior in a community. Self-efficacy is the belief in one's ability to take action, and response efficacy is the perception of the effectiveness of specific actions. We also looked at research focused on affective dimensions, which are comparatively understudied. As I mentioned before, we define affective dimensions here as those that assess an emotional involvement with nature. Such concepts include concern for the environment, sense of responsibility, and place attachment. And the concept of sense of responsibility in our study was inspired by the Hawaiian value of kuleana, which not only translates to responsibility of an individual, but also a sense of reciprocity between the resource, community, and the individual. And finally, we drew from studies on place attachment, which is often defined as the emotional bond between a person and a place. Place attachment can also be divided into two dimensions: the civic and the natural. Civic place attachment considers the meaningful social connections fostered in places. So in our case study on Maui, for example, say you went to the beach regularly with your family, your emotional bond to those activities and the places at the beach would characterize civic place attachment. Alternatively, natural place attachment considers bonds between a person and the biophysical features of a place. So in our example, your connection to the physical features of the coast, the marine life in the area, the color of the water and the sand, that is natural place attachment. And although some evidence suggests that place attachment is related to conservation behavior, only a few studies have examined it through the lenses of civic and natural place attachment. So ultimately, our motivating question was, to what extent are affective and other psychosocial factors related to coral reef conservation behavior? To answer this question, we conducted a survey in person in 2019 along a 10-mile stretch of coastline in West Maui, which you can see from this map here. The coral reefs here create popular surf breaks and lagoons with calm waters great for recreation. However, it is an area of concern due to low fish abundance and poor coral health. And we surveyed a total of 299 people, 216 visitors, and 83 residents. We asked questions about the activities participants engaged in, as well as their perceptions of coral reef health and their concern for the coastal ecosystem on Maui. We also measured several other psychosocial factors as discussed. And I should say, since the study was exploratory, through extensive discussions with the community partners, we settled on 3 questions that would attempt to capture a sense of responsibility. However, given the complex and nuanced translation of kuleana to English, we are not defining the construct as kuleana, but instead simply sense of responsibility. And we also asked about intended personal conservation behavior, for example, wearing reef-safe sunscreen, as well as intended community conservation behaviors, such as volunteering for a beach cleanup. And we also offered respondents the opportunity to sign the Pono Pledge and provide their email address to local conservation organizations. And finally, we did collect demographic information on resident status, age, race and ethnicity, gender, and education. So to implement our regression analyses, we created indices for each of the psychosocial factors and conservation behaviors based on collections of individual survey questions. So for example, the index of natural place attachment was created by taking the average of responses to 3 questions that touched on how much respondents cared about coral reefs in West Maui, how special coral reefs were to them, and how sad they would be if they could not spend time in or near the ocean in West Maui. So then, using a series of multiple regressions, we examined the associations between the psychosocial factors and the 4 behavioral outcomes. And in the results I shared today, I'm going to focus on the affective dimensions of interest in blue, which include the 2 forms of place attachment, sense of responsibility, and concern. And I'm also going to focus on personal and community behavioral intentions. So the first set of results I'd like to share are for personal conservation intentions. And this figure shows the association between intended personal conservation behavior and different psychosocial constructs, which are on the x-axis. Points above 0 indicate a positive association, and points below 0 indicate a negative association. And for those predictors that are significant at the 95% confidence level, the vertical error bar does not cross 0. So the first thing we see is the gray point at the top of the graph, and that is personal conservation intentions seem to be strongly positively associated with personal response efficacy. In other words, when people think that personal conservation actions are effective, they are more likely to indicate that they will engage in those actions. Among the affective dimensions, which are plotted in blue, we found that concern, sense of responsibility, and natural place attachment are all significantly and positively associated with personal conservation intentions. Thus, individuals who reported greater levels of, say, sense of responsibility were more likely to commit to future personal conservation behavior. So this finding with respect to natural place attachment suggests that an individual's attachment to those biophysical features of a place may motivate personal level actions and commitments. Therefore, if community partners hope to promote personal conservation actions, such as wearing reef-safe sunscreen, they could consider leveraging natural place attachment in outreach and engagement. So for our next result, we look at community conservation intentions as the outcome. And this graph has the same format as the one on the previous slide, but instead we are now looking at predictors of community conservation. So here we also found that measures of efficacy, including self-efficacy and community response efficacy, are positively associated with community conservation intentions. But again, focusing on the affective psychosocial factors, we find that community conservation intentions are positively associated with civic place attachment. So the significance of civic place attachment here suggests that a sense of connectedness to the community may motivate collective actions, such as volunteering for a beach cleanup or donating to conservation efforts. And these findings suggest that there is utility in examining place attachment through these two dimensions, as they can provide insight into the motivations of different scales of behavior. So to conclude, our findings provide evidence that affective dimensions are related to place-based coastal conservation behavior. And by including these dimensions in models alongside more commonly examined factors, we may be able to improve the predictive ability of such frameworks. We also found that natural place attachment was associated with personal conservation behavior, while civic place attachment was associated with community conservation behavior. This suggests that natural and civic place attachment may be related to different types of conservation behavior. And all of these findings can be drawn on by the community partners on Maui to design and target coastal user education and outreach more effectively. So now on to chapter 2, entitled Psychological Factors and Social Processes Influencing Wildfire Smoke Protective Behavior, Insights from a Case Study in Northern California. Wildfires are expected to become more frequent and intense in the future due to climate change. And in California, for example, the 5 largest wildfires in the state's history occurred between 2018 and 2021. And the most destructive and deadliest wildfire occurred just 3.5 years ago, the 2018 Camp Fire, which destroyed the town of Paradise, California. And as a personal aside, I actually lived in Paradise, California for about 8 years of my childhood, and I have a number of family connections there. And I mention this only to highlight a piece of my own motivation to study these issues, and the fact that so many of us, especially those of us living in the American West, have now been touched personally by the destruction caused by recent wildfires. So of course, with more wildfire comes more wildfire smoke, which can impact millions of people because of the way that smoke disperses and is transported over long distances. Wildfire smoke contains many pollutants that pose serious cardiovascular and respiratory health risks. It also contributes to the cumulative burden of air pollution, increasing risks to the vulnerable, such as those over 65, those with chronic respiratory health issues like asthma, and those who work outdoors. A recent study has even found that greater smoke exposure may be associated with lower income and poor housing quality. But despite these risks, the factors that motivate protective health and adaptation behavior during smoke events are not well understood. Decisions may be based on awareness and detection of the threat of wildfire smoke by perhaps smelling it outside. However, decisions may also be influenced by social processes, such as the normative signals and support given by close others during a crisis. To understand what social processes may be involved in protective health decision-making, we look to literature suggesting that social norms are likely to influence behavior. So again, social norms can be understood as those informal standards of behavior in a community. A classic example of a descriptive social norm could be related to recycling. If you observe others recycling cans and bottles rather than placing them in the garbage, you may infer that a standard exists that recycling is the appropriate behavior in the community. And we're also interested in social support, which can be defined as the help given or received in the context of a disaster. It can be informational, emotional, or tangible. And an example of tangible support might be during both wildfire smoke and COVID-19 events. Many people either gave or received face masks as gifts from friends and family. So here our motivating question was, how do social processes influence wildfire smoke protective health behavior? And to explore our question, we used a qualitative approach, conducting semi-structured interviews with 45 people who were exposed to dangerous levels of smoke from the campfire in 2018, as well as subsequent fires in 2019 and 2020. We interviewed people in 4 counties in Northern California to ensure that we talked to individuals with different experiences with air pollution. And here in this figure, you can see the counties where we interviewed people overlaid on a map of how many days in November 2018 there was a smoke plume overhead. And in the panel below, you can see the mean daily measurement of fine particulate matter during the period of August to December 2018, with the gray box indicating November 2018, which is when the campfire occurred. And to recruit participants, we worked with 2 community groups active in the region, the Central California Environmental Justice Network and the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. These groups helped us recruit initial participants, and we used snowball sampling after that. We focused on recruiting participants who we defined as vulnerable to smoke. So those over 65, those who suffered from respiratory health issues, outdoor workers, and Spanish language speakers. The interview protocol we developed touched on many topics. We asked participants about their perceptions of fire seasons and previous experiences with air pollution and smoke. We asked how they sensed smoke in the air and where they went to for information about wildfire smoke. We asked about their decisions to mitigate their exposure by consulting the Air Quality Index, or AQI, their perceptions of threat and efficacy, and their interactions with friends and family. And finally, we asked participants what actions they took to protect their health or the health of close others. And to analyze the interview data, we used inductive coding and thematic analysis, looking for emerging themes, as well as deductive coding using constructs from behavioral models and empirical literature on social processes. So through our analysis of the interviews, we developed a conceptual framework, to explain wildfire smoke protective health decision-making. The framework shows how individuals might first perceive information and environmental changes due to wildfire smoke, informing their perceptions of threat and efficacy. And these perceptions can lead directly to protective health action. However, frequently social processes interact with these perceptions to alter the pathway to action. So for example, if an individual watches the wildfire news coverage and smells smoke in the air, this may elevate their perceptions of threat. And these elevated perceptions might result in 2 protective health actions: wearing a mask and limiting their time outdoors. But social processes, such as observing neighbors outdoors not wearing masks, may lead to that individual electing against mask wearing themselves. So to ground the framework in the interview data, I'd like to highlight 3 main themes that emerged from the voices of participants. First, questioning protective actions. So we found that many participants observed inconsistent behavior in their social circle or had to manage conflicting recommendations from friends and family. And these conflicting social norms in the community often led to confusion and questioning. For example, Mario said, "I remember that whole controversy about the different types of masks for the smoke. Some people were saying this type of mask, other people saying, no, that doesn't do anything." Second, interpreting information together. So we found that by frequently checking for and sharing information with close loved ones, many participants described the importance of informational social support. So one participant, Sandra, explained that she resolved her uncertainty about what type of mask to wear by going to the dad source. She said, "Where I got into that black hole was the definition of what's a P95 or P100 filter. Should I pay more for one or the other? I talked to my dad who does machining and is around tiny particulates all day, and he was like, 95 is fine. And so I went with the dad conversation. The dad source is my go-to, probably most reliable, more than the internet source." And finally, protecting vulnerable others. By providing tangible social support and enforcing subjective social norms, participants explained how protective actions were often driven by the desire to not just protect themselves, but also vulnerable others. So for example, Jill bought face masks for her elderly mother. And she said, "I'm her main support person for everything. I think I actually canceled a couple of appointments during that time because I didn't want her out in it. I got her a mask. It probably wasn't an adequate one, but I did the best I could." So in our analysis, we found that many participants took such actions or received masks as gifts from friends and family. And these actions emerged into a subjective social norm, which was the expectation that one should wear a mask if it was given. And this demonstrates how social norms can develop in unexpected ways during natural hazards. So to conclude this chapter, we found that in the case of wildfire smoke, social processes did play an important role in individual protective health decisions. We also learned that during novel hazards, when information is scarce or conflicting, social norms can provide information about appropriate actions. And we found evidence that social support may foster emerging subjective social norms. Finally, it's important to note that the COVID-19 pandemic began while we were in the middle of doing interviews and collecting data for this study. And although it's outside of the scope of this analysis, it prompted us to think about social processes and adaptation behaviors in contexts where there are multiple co-occurring health hazards. We wondered, how might these threats or the behaviors needed to address co-occurring threats relate or interact? Which brings me to my last chapter, which is entitled Social Context and Behavioral Adaptation to Co-occurring Climate-Related Health Hazards. Climate-related health hazards are increasingly co-occurring, which can lead to complex negative impacts on human society. COVID-19 pandemic in particular, with its ongoing global impact, intersects with climate events such as heat waves, hurricanes, wildfires, and wildfire smoke, among others. And there may be ways that these threats actually compound, creating more severe risks to human health. For example, some studies point to a possible association between exposure to smoke and increased COVID-19 incidence and case fatality rates. Also, it may be that the social context or behaviors are connected across different hazards. This is most likely in situations where actions to mitigate risk are similar for co-occurring threats. In the case of wildfire smoke and COVID-19, both involve masking and staying indoors as an appropriate adaptation behavior. Therefore, we ask, what is the role of social context in adaptation behavior in response to wildfire smoke and COVID-19? Several models from public health, natural hazards, and psychology seek to explain adaptation behavior. The protection motivation theory used in health and environmental contexts, protective action decision model often applied in natural hazard settings, and the model of private proactive adaptation to climate change. And all three hold at their core an assumption that adaptation behavior is driven by perceptions of threat or threat appraisal, and perceptions of efficacy or adaptation appraisal. Also, all three of these models acknowledge the role of social context in decision-making, but conceptualize it a bit differently. So in this work, as in chapter 2, we focus on the role of two social factors, social norms and social support. And we focus on these factors because it's not yet clear what their relationship is with adaptation behavior. For example, some studies have shown that social support promotes adaptation, while in others, we've seen that it may inhibit adaptation behavior by, for example, lowering individuals' perception of their susceptibility to a threat. To explore these relationships, we analyzed survey data of a nationally representative sample of 493 US adults. And this data was collected as part of the American Public Opinion on Global Warming survey in the summer of 2020. Our survey included measures of respondents' threat and adaptation appraisal of both wildfire smoke and COVID-19. their perceptions of both giving and receiving social support, their perceptions of descriptive social norms, and their adaptation intentions. And respondents were asked about intentions to engage in adaptation for both wildfire smoke and COVID-19. And although masking and staying indoors are adaptation behaviors for both wildfire smoke and COVID, we did ask people these questions, questions about their intentions specific to each threat. So first, I'd like to highlight some results descriptively, showing how the survey responses related to wildfire smoke and COVID were very similar. And all of the constructs here were measured on a scale of 1 to 5. So we found first that individuals reported high levels of social norms in both contexts, averaging nearly a 4 in the index of mask wearing and general behaviors. Similarly, we found that individuals reported very high levels of social support, averaging slightly over 4 in the index of giving and receiving help. And finally, we found that individuals reported high levels of adaptation intentions in both COVID-19 and wildfire smoke contexts, averaging slightly over 4 in the index of mask wearing and general behaviors. And so in the next few slides, I'm going to show you the results from regressions testing our hypotheses for this study. But for the sake of time, I'm only going to show the results for wildfire smoke, but the statistical relationships are the same in both sign and significance when we look at COVID-19. So our first hypothesis was that threat and adaptation appraisal are positively associated with adaptation intentions. And our analysis supports both of these hypotheses. Interestingly, the association between adaptation appraisal and intentions was nearly twice that of threat, suggesting that perceptions of efficacy may more effectively predict future adaptation behavior. Next, we found that reported descriptive social norms were positively associated with adaptation intentions. So here we see that with about a 0.5 unit increase in descriptive social norms, with a 1 unit increase in descriptive social norms, we see about a 0.5 unit increase in adaptation intentions. Next, we looked at social support as a potential moderator of perceptions of self-efficacy. We expected that social support might change the strength of the relationship between self-efficacy and adaptation intentions. And here it appears that social support may weaken the association between self-efficacy and adaptation, but importantly, this relationship is not statistically significant. However, in a different exploratory test, we looked at whether higher levels of social support weakened or strengthened the relationship between threat appraisal and adaptation intentions. And here we found that greater levels of social support significantly weakened the effect of threat appraisal on adaptation intentions. That's why the coefficient here is negative 0.17. So although this is a significant effect, it's actually quite small, meaning that even with higher levels of social support, that independent effect of threat appraisal on adaptation intentions will remain positive, just slightly less so. However, this does provide evidence that social support has a complex and sometimes counterintuitive effect on how people perceive threat. So our findings from this study provide evidence that threat and adaptation appraisal, as well as descriptive social norms, are key to understanding adaptation behavior for both wildfire smoke and COVID-19. But social support may negatively moderate the relationship between threat appraisal and adaptation behavior, but the interaction between social support and self-efficacy remains uncertain. And overall, this study suggests that it's important to consider social context of co-occurring hazards when designing interventions or communications promoting adaptation behavior. And this image on the right shows health safety guidelines for mask wearing according to the California Department of Public Health. And one could imagine infographics like this one that consider social factors rather than just focusing on the individual. For example, to leverage social comparison, communications could tell people how many of their neighbors or fellow community members report wearing masks. So now for just a brief summary of my dissertation findings. First, in chapter 1, I examined psychosocial factors related to coral reef conservation behavior on Maui, Hawaii. We found that affective dimensions such as sense of responsibility and place attachment are positively associated with personal and community conservation behavior, and that natural and civic place attachment relate to different scales of behavior. My second chapter explored the social processes involved in wildfire smoke protective health decision-making in Northern California. And we found here that social processes influence pathways to protective health decisions, and that social support may foster emerging social norms. And in my third chapter, I investigated adaptation behavior to co-occurring climate-related health hazards in the US. And in this work, we found that descriptive social norms are positively associated with adaptation intentions for both wildfire smoke and COVID, and that social support appears to have a more complex role, possibly undermining the relationships between efficacy and threat perceptions and adaptation intentions. This body of work suggests that exploring social processes and social context deepens our knowledge of adaptation to environmental change, and that studying affective dimensions may lead to new understandings of what motivates conservation behavior. I also show that social context has important implications for the design of public health and conservation interventions. And finally, in chapters 1 and 3, I used cross-sectional surveys to explore statistical associations, which are important because they can identify important patterns of relationships and provide the conceptual basis for future studies. But that said, a limitation is that we cannot claim to have identified causal effects. So future work is needed to look at causal relationships, leveraging different types of data that can be provided through longitudinal studies or interventions. And the work I've done in this dissertation certainly guides my future research ideas. For example, I'm very interested in expanding our understanding of place connections in the context of global climate change. In particular, I'm interested in focusing on not just how we attach or form bonds to special places, but also how humans might detach from such places, especially in the face of dramatic change and loss. I'm also very interested in continuing to explore the ways that social context may influence behavior in counterintuitive ways. And I call this the dark side of social processes. Although it may often be true that social support or social capital are features of communities that promote successful adaptation, there are also ways that these processes may hinder adaptation or promote maladaptive behavior. And finally, I aim to advance innovative and ethical community-engaged research methods. For example, I'm very interested in identifying some of the barriers to and offering ideas on how to co-develop surveys with local communities more effectively. So thank you all so much for listening today, and I'm happy to take questions and chat about the research.
Okay, Kika, amazing talk. And I have to admit, there were times when I didn't understand how the pieces of your dissertation fit together, but I think you did a wonderful job of knitting them together. And I really appreciate looking deeply into what influences the behavior of individuals and communities, especially with respect to conservation and adaptation. One concern I've had, mostly driven by national politics in the US, is individuals seem very perceptive about these issues and make good judgments. And I understand, your sense of place argument is really strong. I'm interested about sense of time. Like, how do people anticipate the threats that are coming? It's almost like everything that was forecast about climate change and temperatures in Paris were ignored or put off as someplace long in the distance. And so what do you think can be done about understanding people's sense of time dealing with these global scale threats?
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate that question. And yeah, I think it really gets to the heart of a challenge that humans have just in being able to kind of understand and conceptualize time beyond our own lifetime, and that we are likely to discount things that are happening, that may happen in the future compared to what is happening in our lives now. And I think you kind of see that in the political atmosphere. People have concerns about the economy right now, and those in the political arena are taking precedence over longer term planning for climate change. And so I think, maybe my first thought is there's a lot of literature and great work being done by Stanford folks on looking at how personal experiences, how some of these current events, which I think tried to kind of bring this topically today, because in a way we are all living through some of these climate impacts. And if we can make those connections to things that are happening now, that are current, I think that we may have an opportunity to kind of leverage that into action, and perhaps also into more sort of collective political action. So I would say that it's one opportunity to do that, but it's a really tough nut to crack, and I think it's an element of probably what we'll continue to work on.
Thank you, Kika. We have a couple of more questions here. We have one from Randall Holmes. Randall wants to know, how would you expect these findings to be generalizable? Is a study of sense of place in Hawaii applicable to other places? Are responses to California wildfire threats representative of responses to fire threats elsewhere?
Very good question. Yeah, so this is something, I think as someone who's worked in communities, I think there's incredible value to doing work that is focused on a very specific place, a very specific community, and focusing on that, investigating there. But of course, I think the goal is to inform theory more generally, and then also to hopefully bring some of these insights to perhaps behavioral frameworks that can be tested through different types of channels. So I think that was one of the goals that my colleagues and I had by testing some of our ideas that were generated through the study in California around wildfire smoke behavior, and then looking at how that really held up across the nation in a nationally representative survey. So again, that was still a cross-sectional survey, so we can't infer causality, but we did see a lot of really interesting, significant associations between some of those social factors that we had discovered through the qualitative work. So yeah, that's just one example, I think, of a goal of mine is to build upon theory generating work that's often through qualitative studies to then test more generally. And I definitely think that the ultimate goal is to inform those frameworks, such as the ones I described in chapter 3, which are aiming at sort of generally explaining adaptation behavior across different threats. So if we could have an understanding across different threats, I think that we'd be much more successful at promoting adaptation behavior.
Thanks, Kika. Another question from David Gonzalez. David says, great presentation, Kika. Given the role of social connections with shaping people's responses to hazards such as wildfire smoke, I'd love to hear more of your thoughts about translating social psychology theory to public health researchers and practitioners.
That's a really good question. Well, I hope that David and I can work on this question together. But yeah, I think this is sort of a challenge of scale, and public health is often looking at large groups of people looking at sort of average responses and social psychology is looking at really individual behavior. So I think that there are probably some, I know that there are some really interesting opportunities to leverage technology and new data sets to connect the types of understandings and interests I have in individual behavior, and then be able to look at that in the aggregate to explain perhaps where people are moving, how they're exposed sort of at that granular level, can then intersect perhaps more appropriately with public health. But that's a long-term goal for sure. Thanks for that question.
Thank you, Kika, for your responses and for these excellent questions. I know that many people would like to engage these conversations, although in the interest of time, I'm going to cut off the Q&A at this time because we just have we're getting close to the hour. And Kika, I want to give you a few more minutes. I know you have a couple more slides. And so we'll turn back to you for right now, and then you can turn it back to me at the very end.
Okay, great. All right, so before wrapping up my personal thank yous, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the lands upon which I've lived, worked, and conducted research. So on these lands, I was a guest visiting for the purpose of study. So first, I'd like to acknowledge the Mukwema Ohlone tribe as the traditional and current inhabitants of the land on which I lived and worked while studying at Stanford, and that this land continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Aina, or land, of Maui Island, which is part of the larger territory recognized by Indigenous Hawaiians as their ancestral grandmother, Papahano Moku. And I recognize that Her Majesty Queen Liliuokalani yielded the Hawaiian Kingdom and territories under duress by the United States, and that Hawaii remains an illegally occupied state. Okay, so there are so many people to thank who have come through my life at different moments of schooling and my career, who've supported me in this path to a PhD. And I don't have time to name everyone individually, but I am incredibly grateful, and I plan to be reaching out to folks over the next few weeks to express my gratitude directly. But I do want to mention a few organizations and individuals who are instrumental in helping me carry out this research. So first, the community partners I worked with, Pu'unu'ihiu, the Nature Conservancy, the Central California Environmental Justice Network, and the Central Valley Air Quality Coalition. Thank you so much for your time and for your assistance in our research together. Of course, I also want to thank my committee, Nicole Ardoin, Gabrielle Wong-Parodi, Larry Crowder, and Bill Durham, as well as my chair, Michelle Anderson. I'd like to thank you all for sharing your wisdom, providing feedback, and really encouraging me along the way. It's been incredible to learn from you all over these past 6 years. Also, a really big thanks to my research colleagues and co-authors who are listed here, my cohort in E-IPER, and the entire E-IPER community, staff, students, and alumni. And importantly, all of the members of the lab communities that I participated in during my studies, the folks in the Wong-Parodi lab, Crowder lab, Social Ecology lab, and the Ecology and Society lab. And finally, I want to thank my family and so many friends who I could truly not list everyone here, who've been so supportive. And I especially want to thank my mom, my husband Casey, and my kitty Marty for keeping me laughing and smiling over these past few years, which have been kind of a wild ride. And of course, finally, I want to thank the many funders who supported my work materially, the E-IPER Summer Research Grant, the Diversity Dissertation Research Opportunity, Community Engagement Grant, the Guy Leverson Research Fellowship, the Edge Fellowship, and the Lieberman Fellowship, which provided the funding for my last year. So thank you all so much. And if you are coming through Paris in the next year, please say hello. Would love to see you and take you to our favorite boulangerie. Otherwise, I will hopefully see you all back in the US next year when we move home. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Kika. I wish we could be in a room to give you a warm round of applause at this point, but imagine all of us there with you, and huge congratulations. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today and attending. Please look for an email later today from Tran, who's E-IPER's Assistant Director of Student Services, who will announce the results of Kika's defense. So typically, well, at this point, we'll have a closed door session with the committee. And then typically after an E-IPER student has passed their dissertation defense, as you know, we normally would gather on the balcony outside of E-IPER, or in this virtual format, we would host a reception. However, as Kika has just told us, she is in Paris, which is not a terrible place to be, but what that does is it means that it will be late in the evening for her. And so having a virtual defense, even a virtual reception, would be challenging. So instead, once you get the message from we would encourage you to send private messages to Kika to congratulate her after you hear from So now, Kika and members of the Oral Examination Committee, please join me for the closed door session of the defense through the other Zoom link that Kika sent. And the rest of you, have a great day. Thanks so much again for joining us.